Hey now, RotoGrinders. Welcome to week 2 of the NFL preseason here on RotoGrinders.com. My name is Chris Gimino. I am joined once again by Kyle Murray, back after taking a pinch hit from Dean last week for week number 1. Kyle, you missed all some exciting action last week. We had starters scoring 15 fantasy points. We had last-minute, late-breaking news in Atlanta. We had a game straight up stop before the game was over. Just a little bit of everything last weekend. How was your trip? Are you ready to get back to it?
Yeah, the trip was good. I was definitely finding myself checking in on preseason and whatnot as I was away. But yeah, I looked down at my phone and I saw a Jamar Chase touchdown. I was like, "What the heck? This doesn't sound very preseason esque." So hopefully we can find some more names, deeper in the garbage bin for week 2 of the preseason. But I'm excited to break it down with you.
Yep, took some getting used to the 4 points mattering for your roster sometimes, and all that kind of stuff that happens in preseason DFS. But for those of you who are unfamiliar, preseason does not feature some of your favorite players. In fact, it features none of your favorite players almost. You will have to parse through the news, the information, the beat writers, the practice reports to try to determine who's actually going to be on the field in each and every one of these games. And then from there, there's a little bit of art to figuring out exactly how much to expect each player to play and how efficient they should be when they are on the field. The end game is, of course, to defeat all your opponents in daily fantasy competition. Sometimes that is easier said than done. So let's get to breaking it down for this 2-game slate on Friday, Kyle. And it is not an exciting 2-game slate. The quarterback position is not exceptionally clear in terms of a very tippy top play. So when you take a look at these 4 teams, we've got Atlanta, Tennessee, Kansas City, Seattle. How are we breaking it down at the quarterback position? Who's actually going to be on the field this week?
Yeah, I think looking at the screen at the top of our projections right now, we do have Brandon Allen projected for the highest fantasy point number there, and I think that comes alongside playing time, right? I think his playing time looks pretty projectable, pretty safe. Only expected to see Cam Ward for about 2 series, and then after that, it'll turn weight to Brandon Allen and then Trevor Siemian. But Trevor Siemian was just signed 3 days ago, so you got to pretty much gather that you're probably not going to see a ton of Siemian. Maybe at the back end of that game, they're just getting him a little bit familiar with the playbook, but I do think it should be for the majority of the time Brandon Allen getting reps with the Titans there. And I do think it's worth noting that the Titans actually lead the slate in terms of implied team totals. So I think a lot of that is due to the fact that we are expected to see their starters play for at least a couple of drives, but nonetheless, that team total is worth mentioning there. So that's kind of a big reason why we see Brandon Allen amongst the top of the board of projected quarterbacks. And then right above him, Easton Stick. Saw him play pretty well in that week 1 preseason game against the Lions that got cut short. Worth noting, you look at Easton Stick last week when he went, was it 15 for 18, 150 yards and a touchdown. That is by far his best preseason performance. When you look back to last season, we saw Easton Stick play a lot of football in the preseason last year for the Chargers. Threw 55 pass attempts, averaged just over 5 yards per attempt, completed less than half of his attempts. So Easton Stick has been a preseason jabroni and this season so far, looking like he's potentially turned a corner. At least he's shown the ability to have a decent performance there. We should see him on the field for quite a bit. Pennick's not going to play. Kirk Cousins unlikely to play. So it's just him and Emory Jones. I will say maybe there's a chance that we see Jones get a little bit of extra reps because he didn't get to play much last week. But I do think there's a good chance that Jones is on his way out the door once the season actually starts. So it might make more sense to see what Stick can do with this Falcons offense. So those are the top 2 projected guys behind him. Jalen Milroe, a little bit more question marks with the playing time there, as he's going to be splitting time with Darnold and Drew Lock, but we saw what he can do in week 1. Dual threat guy. Obviously, he's going to look to run quite a bit, and I do think there's a very, very strong reason for the Seahawks to go out and not only look at Jalen Milroe, but just give him reps. Obviously, he's a development guy, so those are probably the top 3 quarterbacks for me in this one.
Easton Stick has 5 career rushing touchdowns in the preseason, which sounds great until you realize this is his 6th preseason of getting substantial run. He has 290 attempts in his preseason career and 6 touchdowns. That is a 2.1% touchdown rate, and that is not good. I don't care who you are. You cannot be excited about Easton Stick being one of your top options on the slate. So pretty much we got a garbage quarterback slate, folks. But we got to play somebody. He's certainly on the menu. Okay, so once you get past those 3 guys, right, then you've got what? The Kansas City guys? Like, where are we looking if you're going deeper down the menu here, because this is certainly a slate where you could start to get cute.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you were looking to, maybe get a little bit more contrarian or a little bit more off the wall there, I think Kansas City is, definitely the next place to look. And obviously, it's the only team that we haven't really touched on quarterback wise. Mahomes is unlikely to play in this one, so we're going to see a mix of Minshew, Zappy, and Oladipo. So, I mean, when you look at Gardner Minshew, who's been playing with the first team quite a bit in practice this week, he's going to start most likely. There's a little bit of a narrative that I've been seeing on social media that maybe they're going to give some extra reps because he's heading over to Washington, where he has a little bit of a cult following from his days at Washington State in college. Not necessarily buying into that too much. I do think Bailey Zappi is probably the guy I would, hope to see more playing time from if we're looking to chase somebody with a higher upside for preseason. I do think he's probably more likely to play more than the third string quarterback here. But with Minshew starting, if he plays into the second quarter, he's going to look pretty good. So I think Zappy and Minshew are probably the two Kansas City guys I'm most likely to take a stand on here or take a shot on for a tournament quarterback.
There's no way you can love Emory Jones. Certainly looks like he's on the Easton Stick track in terms of his quarterback passing play throughout the preseason, but also, cap on top of that he's their fourth quarterback right now. I hear people yapping about Kirk Cousins being on the block. Of course he is, but I mean, who's paying that contract? So
yeah,
it's going to be difficult for me to see the Falcons getting off him, difficult for me to see Emory Jones getting into a whole lot of football games. As a result, he's just a camp body as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
Cam Ward is going to play 2 series. I don't think we can do the Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase thing here, right? I mean, that seems a little bit ridiculous considering the disparity between the Bengals top ranked passing offense in the world and the Titans, who were, well, they were not.
Yeah, very good point. Obviously, it's tough to fill those shoes, but if he ends up leading 2 touchdown drives, it's going to be a spot where they're certainly going to potentially pay off there. I will say maybe a spot where the public is more on a guy like Cam Ward, so gives you a little bit more reason to fade, knowing that the playing time is probably not going to be significant, and you just kind of cross your fingers and hope for some inefficient drives or maybe a couple 3-and-outs, but mainly just no scoring drives, because I would guess that Cam Ward's going to be a guy who people are clicking on more naturally than someone like Emory Jones. So the ownership will probably be following Cam Ward a little bit, especially after a solid week 1 showing. Another name worth mentioning, we talked about this a little bit before we went live with Seattle, but obviously Milroe is going to be the preferred target from the Seahawks there. But I do think Drew Lock is at least worth a tournament dart, especially if you're playing several lineups. I think there's a pretty good chance that Sam Darnold and company only play 1 or 2 drives. Last season in the preseason, we saw Geno Smith play just 5 snaps when they let their starters play in their 1 preseason game. So that's going to be the same case where McDonald gets Darnold and company out of there after just 1 drive. If Drew Lock gets quarter and a half, I think you can argue that he could easily find his way into the end zone a couple of times and certainly pay off there. So worth mentioning at least Drew Lock as a tournament option. He's certainly a guy who I would rather take a shot on, at least playing time wise, than a couple of these other options.
All right, let's get into the running backs. We have a little bit easier time figuring out the running back position, but it's still not absolutely fantastic. Starting at the top here, what are we seeing with Kansas City and Brashard Smith? Certainly the best ball streets were filled with people dying on the Brashard Smith hill. Are we ready to anoint him for this particular preseason slate, given the context of Kareem Hunt's injury?
Yeah, I think if you're someone who was high on Brashard Smith, or I know there's a lot of people out there who are even suggesting that he could be potentially the RB2 for this team come the regular season, you probably didn't walk away from that week 1 performance feeling great about that take. But I think you can at least feel pretty good about potential playing time or potential upside in the preseason, because again, even though he was, I believe, the 4th or 5th running back to step on the field in week 1, probably not good for regular season, but that is going to typically translate to more playing time throughout the course of the preseason. And he's a guy who, profiles well for preseason, right? A guy who can catch passes, obviously being a converted wide receiver, certainly has some explosive ability, one of the more quicker players in the draft last season. So he certainly checks all those boxes in terms of dynamic playmaker, explosive playmaking potential. So I think those things are certainly working in Brashard Smith's favor. And for all the preseason reasons, we like somebody, Smith checks those boxes, although probably not feeling too good about any, season-long bags being held for Brashard Smith.
Converted wide receiver. He's got the passing game skills. So on the PPR DraftKings, you're certainly interested in what Smith can bring to the table here. It seems like a fairly, I don't want to say, there's no such thing as a safe option in preseason, but he's going to be out there, and you're probably going to see him involved in the passing game in some capacity. I do like Smith here as much as I like anyone on this slate. The Atlanta guys are certainly of interest. Unfortunately, there are 3 of them, but that's the entirety of what there are. I think they only have 3 backs available. So that actually works out quite well for a preseason. Of course, they have to deal with Easton Stick and Emory Jones as the quarterbacks. So how are we breaking this down? Dotson was the guy who got the first crack last week. Nate Carter had his opportunities truncated by the shortened game. Corbin, just the same story. He was out there for 14 snaps. He only actually got 1 carry. So what are we doing with Atlanta?
Yeah, Atlanta's interesting because you see a team with likely only 3 running backs in the room for this preseason game. That's typically going to be a spot that you like, but when there's not really any clear separators between them, it kind of makes it difficult for us. And I think that's probably going to lead to some lower ownership on these guys, even though they do have a thin room. I mean, last week, like you mentioned, Dotson got the first crack at 5 carries for a whopping 0 yards. So I think people are going to be underwhelmed by that. Nate Carter, Michigan State player, was pretty inefficient at Michigan State, although you can't necessarily chalk that up to just him. Obviously, did not have a ton of help around him in that very bad team last year. But Jashawn Corbin, UFL hero at times last season. I think all 3 of these guys are certainly in the player pool. It's more so just trying to find the differentiators here. For me, I prefer Dotson of this group. He's just a guy who we've seen do it at times in the preseason in the past. Last year with the Chargers, he had a couple of big runs last year in the preseason. So obviously only a whopping 0 yards on the ground on his 5 carries last week. Probably not going to expect that once again here. Worth noting, the Falcons have the lowest team total on the board in this one, just 17 implied team total. So it's gonna happen when you are having an offense led by a guy who has a combined 60 QB rating in his preseason days, Easton Stick and Emory Jones, a guy who probably won't have a contract at the end of this month, but nonetheless, opportunity should be there for these Falcons players. But I'm curious to see maybe where ownership or game theory comes in with these guys, as obviously with only 3 players in the backfield, are they going to be overvalued because there's only 3 guys here? Or is it a spot where, since all these situation issues that we've mentioned with bad quarterback play, low implied team total, no real separator in this group, is that going to lead to lower ownership? So I think that's going to be the main thing I'm trying to solve here with this Falcons backfield.
Yeah, difficult. I feel like Corbin and Carter are the guys that I would have liked anyway, because I just don't like Elijah Dotson and I think 0 yards per carry isn't that surprising to me, to be honest with you. But at the same time, no guarantees here with whether or not even Corbin is going to get touches. Like I said, 14 snaps, 1 carry last week. But I do think the shortened game, maybe one of those 2 guys ends up with a little bit extra work, as they did not get the full evaluation that the preseason would have otherwise afforded them last week. Okay, on to Tennessee. So you've got a situation in Tennessee where Tony Pollard has been promised by the Tennessee brass to be somewhat managed this season, not necessarily get the full complement of touches that he got last year in the office. The way they were going to do that was they were going to use more Tyjae Spears, who of course is out with an ankle injury. So now we are talking about entering this preseason game, looking at the running back 3 competition as the primary point of focus. We have preseason hero, Julius Chestnut, available as the incumbent. We have your Michigan Wolverines' own Khalil Mullings as somebody who is putting the absolute spokes to him in that job competition right now, looking to try to win that job. It looks like the numbers right now are sort of leaning in the direction of Mullings. I don't know if it's that far apart. So how are you going to make heads or tails of this particular competition in this game against the Falcons?
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that I think there's at least a chance that although the Titans are going to play their starters for 2 series, I wouldn't be fully surprised if we don't see Pollard out there for the full extent of that, just because of the fact that Spears got banged up in that week 1 game. So is there really a significant need to throw Tony Pollard out there for passing situations, just to potentially throw his body on the line for a couple of pass pro reps? Like I don't think that that's out of the question, that they might just say, okay, let's get either Chestnut or Mullings in there with the first team and that would only help those guys. And I don't think many people are considering Tony Pollard, but I think it's at least worth considering that there's maybe some caution there with Pollard, who might but might be needed a little bit more in week 1 and week 2 potentially, with Spears dealing with that high ankle sprain. Mullings is definitely the guy I prefer here. I think it was very evident last week that they were trying to get him the ball when he was on the field. 7 snaps, 7 rush attempts on those rushing plays there. So it seems like when they're running the ball and he's on the field, it's obviously going to be going to him. 33 yards in those 7 carries. Right around a 5 yards per attempt number there for Mullings. No surprise. I mean, he was a very efficient runner. He's a guy who is a big body, hard to bring down. So I think he also fits the bill for a guy who can handle a lot of volume. So that makes a lot of sense to potentially see him handle significant workload, especially with Spears being absent now from this Titans rotation of running backs. And then you have Chestnut, who's definitely made his stamp be shown in preseasons past, where he's definitely had a couple of big games. But like you mentioned, it's definitely been the Khalil Mullings show at times in camp, unseating Chestnut for this backup role. So I prefer Mullings over Chestnut, but I do think both of those guys are certainly in play, as it looks like Mims and Jefferson are sort of just back end guys for this Titans running back room, while Chestnut and Mullings are probably going to be the two to handle the majority of the load for these running backs.
Last week, my guy, George Olani, got in the end zone. Damian Martinez absolutely stunk, under 2 yards a carry. This week, we've got probably Kenneth Walker and Charbonnet out there for some period of time. I'm not sure exactly how many carries to expect from those guys in the first couple of series, but we certainly should see at least one of them. So how does that affect your opinion of Holani and Martinez in this game? Do you think either one of them is shown the opportunity to get it done on this short slate?
Yeah, I might have some crow to eat after talking about Damian Martinez versus George Holani probably 2 months ago at this point. But yeah, Martinez did me no favors with that stinker performance, and obviously Holani found the end zone and averaged right around 9 yards per carry. So big game for him. I think Holani's the guy to go back to here in this spot. I do think that while starters are going to play, are we really going to see them put Kenneth Walker out there for any more than a couple of plays? Honestly, obviously he's been on this sort of managed workload in practice with this foot injury. It's been a big thing for Kenneth Walker his whole career, pretty much since leaving college, where he's always been dealing with injuries. So I don't think we'll see him a ton. Zach Charbonnet is obviously going to be important for this team in the regular season. So I do think we see Holani and Martinez play a lot after maybe the first drive or two. So those are going to be the two guys for me for Seattle.
Fortunately, they do some other guys on the roster here. Anthony Tyus, Jacardia White, I believe the guy's name is. He actually looked pretty good last week. So they had some other guys that were available to play. I think that should come to fruition here in this game too. So the projection's a little bit lower on the Seattle backs overall. But again, in preseason, where essentially the only 1 yard you need to gain is across the goal line, and you're pretty good to go. You can certainly rely on Martinez and Holani if you wanted to on the very short slate. Just not quite as good looking as some of the other guys, albeit very, very difficult to differentiate between any of the guys we just mentioned. Okay, wide receiver. A little bit easier to parse this than the other two positions, I will say. This is probably my favorite position of the three. Let's break it down here. We've got some guys that people have been drafting in their best ball lineups at the very top, some guys that maybe nobody is drafting ever in their best ball lineups beyond that. Let's get to the top three guys. Break it down. These three rookies that everyone's been drafting. Tell the people who they are. Tell them why we should like them here for DFS in week 2.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with Io Manor, because I think he's the most interesting person to talk about from a preseason versus regular season perspective. Obviously, his name's been thrown out a lot with obviously the Treylon Burks injury as someone who could potentially step into a bigger role. I think if you're somebody who is drafting him for best ball or season long, whatever it may be, you're probably pumping the brakes a little bit after what we saw in week 1 with Van Jefferson playing a ton with that first team. But I don't think it's anything to be overly concerned about. Obviously, this is a guy who you're expecting to sort of develop more as the season goes along. But for preseason, I think that's great news. I think we're probably going to see him even more in preseason, continue to not only play more, but earn more design targeted plays for Io Manor here in the preseason. So I think that's all good news. I think if it was a spot where he was locked in as the wide receiver 3 coming into the regular season, we probably don't see him as much in the preseason. So I do think we're going to continue to see him not only play, but also, earn some design targets here for this team. I do think he's going to play with a little bit with the first team offense. And then again, once Brandon Allen's in there with Cameron Ward out. So I think best of both worlds there for Io Manor. And then for Torrey Horton, he's a guy who is kind of, I don't want to say come out of nowhere because he did have a very good college career. But for me, when I was looking at this team a couple of months ago, when we were setting up the season-long projections, I sort of just assumed MVS was going to be the guy to be the wide receiver 3. And by all accounts, MVS is playing a lot with the second team here in practices. And if Horton's going to be a guy who is eventually going to be the wide receiver 3 in this offense and playing in 3 wide receiver sets on Sundays, that's going to take away from MVS from a season-long perspective. But I do think still for this slate in particular, still probably going to see Torrey Horton trying to earn more of that role. I do think his playing time will still be very significant. And I just think he's a good talent. Again, he's another guy similar to Io Manor who I think will benefit from being able to play with the first team while they're there, as well as playing with Drew Lock, who I think is going to arguably be one of the better, throwers of the football outside of these actual starters here. So I think it's a great spot for Torrey Horton. He'd be my favorite receiver on this slate. And then for Royals, same deal here. A guy with some, very strong playmaking reports out of camp. Playing time should be significant. Played, I think, 40% of snaps in week 1. So we have him as the top projected quarterback in the spot or receiver in the spot. And again, when you're looking at him catching passes from, guys like Bailey Zappi and potentially Gardner Minshew, that also is a pretty solid spot to be in as well. So he along with the other two, look pretty good this week.
Couple of notes here. First, the Titans game last week was raining. It was pretty ugly throughout the entire game. So I wouldn't really chalk up too much of Io Manor's, lack of like absolutely stellar production in 42% of snaps as anything that I would call concerning just yet. All reports out of camp is he's out there making plays. Horton, one thing about the Seahawks is they have an identity brewing, right? One of the beat writers tweeted they have 4% of their roster right now can play fullback. They have 2 tight ends. They're certainly going to be out there, and 2 tight end looks a lot, whether it's MVS or Horton in the regular season. I would not be scared 1 iota of Horton doing well so far as it pertains to him having his time limited out there in preseason. And if anything, I think it's going to get him out there more often. I think he's certainly got every opportunity to do it again this week with maybe Darnold. He'll get out there with Darnold, but he'll certainly get out there with Drew Lock, and that's going to be pretty good for him. And Jalen Royals had an end zone target last week. Maybe they'll go ahead and try to rekindle that, get him in the box this week. Should be a good spot for him as well. Now, 2 names I want to mention on Atlanta. Maybe if you got a take on these guys that I don't, but I think these guys are possible slate winners. Dylan Drummond, Nick Nash, both of these guys are going to play a lot. Most likely, I think Drummond's going to play earlier in the game. Nash will play later in the game. Guy barely played last week, 3 for 35. This guy actually gets some snaps this week to watch out. How are you treating these 2 Atlanta guys? Am I absolutely crazy for thinking that this could go in the right direction for them?
No, I think for Nick Nash, I think the one thing that I would have had some pause on is that he's probably going to be playing a lot of those snaps with Emory Jones. But I mean, all of his production last week came with Emory Jones as well. So maybe there's a little bit of pause there. But I mean, Nick Nash was somebody who was incredibly productive. He actually led the NCAA in receiving yards last year. So this is a guy who has produced, no matter where he's been. I think those kinds of guys typically make for pretty good preseason additions as well. I do think, though, due to the argument of would I rather have my receiver running routes with Easton Stick throwing passes versus Emory Jones, I honestly don't know if there's that much of a difference considering what we've seen from Stick in the past. But last week, I will say Stick did look a lot better. So I'll give this slight advantage to a guy like Dylan Drummond or even Chris Blair, who also found the end zone last week. But I mean, Drummond had 8 targets last week, and we've talked at times, even for the Hall of Fame game, we've talked about guys who can see targets in the preseason. I think it was Rice from the Chargers who had like 12 targets last year and 1 catch. Dylan Drummond had 8 targets and 8 catches there. So he's definitely been a guy who's produced in preseasons in the past, and he continued that on week 1. So I would prefer Drummond slightly, and then Nash, and then probably Blair. But I think all of these guys look really strong. I think all their playing time should be pretty significant here for the Falcons.
Last couple of names, 2 different guys on the Titans. One that we know very well, Calvin Ridley. Like if you wanted to take a gamble on a early drive touchdown, he had 11 snaps last week and 3 targets for 50 yards. Clearly, he's going to be a guy that Ward's going to look to, especially if they're not looking to run the ball early in the game so much now that they are a little bit shorthanded in the backfield. Maybe you could expect them to come out and try to work on the passing game a little bit. Not crazy, not something I'm going overly out of my way to acquire, just something that's worth mentioning. Diki on the, how do you say this guy's name? Jameer Diki.
Yeah, DK.
This dude can run the go route. He can get down the field. He got a deep target last week. Kick return specialist as well. 37% of snaps in week 1. Not someone that I'm absolutely loving, but he is, again, if you're looking for anyone to put on your radar on a short slate to try to mix it up a little bit, I think he's someone that you could look to. Is there anybody else I'm missing?
I mean, I guess you can throw Restrepo in there if maybe they want to give him a chance to see what he can do a little bit more. But I do agree that, DK would be a guy I prefer. He profiles as a little bit more of an explosive guy. I think he's probably more likely to score than Restrepo. But I think both of those guys are fine, especially considering the fact that we're probably going to have some interest in Brandon Allen. And you can argue that, Allen's probably going to play from, the halfway point of the first quarter at least through at the halfway point of the third quarter, maybe a little bit less, give or take. But, so a lot of these guys are going to be correlating with Allen as well. So, yeah, DK, Restrepo are probably the two that I'm looking at the most. And especially when you look at a lot of these guys here in the back end of this depth chart, a lot of them only played a few snaps at the end of the game with Tim Boyle last week. Obviously, Tim Boyle waived now, but a lot of those guys you can argue probably aren't going to see a ton of playing time this week. And therefore, some of these guys are probably going to have more playing time with Allen. And DK is the guy who actually played the most snaps with Brandon Allen last week. So he's going to be my preferred option outside of Io Manor here for the Titans.
Tight end's never all that much fun to talk about in preseason. I don't think this week is any different, especially on the 2-gamer on Friday. Arroyo is certainly going to be like 1,000,000% owned again this week because everyone knows him, and he's the only one, frankly, that anyone knows on the entire slate. That's an option. So what are we doing at tight end?
Yeah, I mean, Arroyo obviously has the top projection for us, and I think that's reasonable. He's going to be the guy has the best passing game acumen. I mean, his backup Marshall Lang had 3 targets, caught 2 of them for 20 yards last game. So he's a guy who, if you wanted to maybe look for a more natural game theory pivot play, you can make a case for him. But yeah, the position is pretty weak, like you mentioned. Gunnar Helm would probably be my second favorite option behind Arroyo. I mean, Helm's a guy who I sort of thought as a guy who might break through as the tight end 2 in this offense prior to preseason. Didn't really look like that was going to be the case after the way they sort of played Okonkwo and Weil. But I think Helm's going to be the guy who I think has a decent pass game ability there as well. So he's probably going to be my second favorite tight end here.
Let's see. Gunnar Helm, a 53rd percentile agility score. That's pretty good. 23rd percentile speed, 25th percentile catch radius. He's a bit of a clunker out there, if you ask me. Compare that to the Atlanta Falcons listed behind the depth chart in the position of Kyle Pitts. Maybe he'll actually be any good, unlike Kyle Pitts. 93rd percentile burst score, 86th percentile catch radius, 83rd percentile speed. Josh Simon, can we get behind it? 2 for 9 last week, but his snaps were truncated. Am I insane here? Is this guy actually somebody who could get out there and maybe do some damage with these lower end quarterbacks who might be looking a little bit more narrowly on the target tree towards closer to the line of scrimmage where he might be?
Yeah, I think the one argument I would make against Simon is, like we've talked about, a couple of different Atlanta wide receivers that we liked. So I don't know how much you want to overload lineups with significant pass catchers here from the Falcons, but maybe if it's a spot where you aren't playing more than one receiver, I think Simon is definitely a guy who at least fits the bill physically as a guy who can make some big plays, especially like you mentioned, near the line of scrimmage there on these short routes. So I think if you're not going overboard on receivers, I think Simon makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, I probably was way too excited about a guy who was an undrafted free agent out of South Carolina. He's almost 25 years old as a rookie. But, it is the preseason, Kyle. At some point, we have to find somebody to put in the lineup. And absolutely everyone's going to play Arroyo, and probably a lot of people are going to play Helm too. Yeah. You might see some people go to Kansas City, where Tunyon played a bunch last week, and actually it's a pretty good production, which is unusual for a 31-year-old. What are we doing with him as compared to someone, say, like a Jared Wiley?
Yeah, I still think, even though Tunyon was sort of the guy to break through with more production, I still think Wiley's going to be the guy that I look at. I mean, he only had 1 target last week. Tunyon did have 4 targets, but still, I think it's going to be a spot where I'm typically going to bank on the guy who's a little bit more athletic, a little bit younger, and I do think he's probably going to be a guy who they would like to see more reps from. So I think Wiley is still going to be the guy I give the edge to over Tunyon, especially because I'd probably be a spot where I guess the public is itching to get back to Tunyon after the 3 for 49 game last week.
A couple of other human beings who will breathe oxygen on a football field on Friday. You could look at maybe someone like Felipe Franks. He will certainly be alive, hopefully, during the game and available to catch passes. If you were looking for the Will Dissly of the week, someone who could catch a touchdown on the first drive unexpectedly, may I present to you AJ Barner of the Seattle Seahawks. Yes, the Will Dissly of the week, AJ Barner. That's my new segment that I will be doing each and every slate. Just kidding. But that, of course, I'm not kidding about the idea that maybe somebody on one of these first drive situations could get something done, maybe a Chig Okongwu. Not exciting, but again, tight end is not exciting in general. So if you are going to fade the chalk, good luck rolling the dice. Defense, Kyle, you have anything for us?
I mean, the most significant note I can make from a defense perspective is going back to these implied team totals. I think from a roster construction perspective, if you have a team where you don't have any offensive players in your lineup, that's probably the defense you should be playing. It's such a small slate that's literally all the reason that you need. But I'll reference these implied team totals again. Falcons are the lowest at 17 implied points. Chiefs second lowest 18.25, and then the Seahawks, and then the Titans with the highest. So by that account, the Titans would probably be the top defense for me, and then the Seahawks probably the second defense for me. But again, I think it all comes back to roster construction, where you should be looking at your team and saying, okay, if I don't have any offensive players, this is probably the defense that I want to play. So I would just keep that in mind.
Yeah, and frankly, I don't know how worried I would be about having offensive players against my defense in preseason anyway. It could go south for absolutely any one of these quarterbacks and teams. Folks, that is going to do it for week number 2's Friday slate breakdown here on RotoGrinders. Best of luck in all your contests. For Kyle Murray, I'm Chris Gimino. We'll be back again next week one more time for preseason week 3. Good luck out there.